Now it's on, right? Okay. So great to see so many of you here today. I mean, the weather taken into consideration in Denmark, if it's like this, nobody shows up to anything, is usually the case. But really today, a lot of you have come, and I'm really happy about that. I also think it says something about the topic that multilateralism is really sort of one of the most topical issues to discuss at the moment, not least because of our relationship with the Americans and what the Americans are actually doing in the world. Has implications for all of us. It has implications for us in Denmark, but it also has implications, of course, for how the EU sort of like getting closer and closer than it has ever been, perhaps, and that we're seeing also the opposite sort of processes and dynamics happening in Africa, where the African Union is actually becoming looser and there's less integration in on the African continent. So all this just to say that what's happening right now really has quite substantial implications for how multilateralism is playing out across the world. So that's also what we're going to talk about today. We have our guest from outside, Richard Gowan, who is the head of UN engagement at the Crisis Group, and also one of the people that I know who knows the most about the UN. Apart from working in the Crisis Group, obviously writing a lot on the UN, he's also advising a lot of the countries that are either on the Security Council or bidding to become members of the Security Council. So he's, of course, also here in that capacity, and we are very thankful to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for lending us Richard for this open public seminar, so everybody can get a chance to ask questions. The other person that I'm really happy to introduce here as well is Mona Sheikh. She is a more known person to me since she's my boss upstairs, but she's also a person who's been talking about the global order and how the global order is changing and shifting, both when the West was actually more dominant, yes, we are that old, and also now where there's sort of like more sort of like a breakup in the world order and becoming clearer that something new is happening and what that order or global orders then are going to look like. So we have both sort of the more sort of like theoretical, maybe abstract discussion based on very specific and concrete fieldwork, I know. And then we also have the more UN specific conversation about what is it that's happening to the UN as the embodiment of multilateralism in the world. So I'm really happy about that sort of lineup. And I would like to then welcome Mona first, and then Richard will take over in 10-15 minutes. So please. And let's...
Thank you, Peter, and thank you also, of course, for the invitation to reflect a bit on how international governance can work even with this new situation, even with this US-sized hole in it, as a recent article said in Financial Times. So there's no doubt that we are facing this moment where a lot of transformations are taking place, particularly, of course, in the global balance of power, as Peter has already pointed out, but not only between states, but perhaps more interestingly, we are seeing new types of actors, new non-state actors, for example, private companies, enterprises, business enterprises, and so on, and new types of conflicts becoming increasingly impactful, forces us to rethink the forms of global and regional collaboration that we have in the world today. So the political background of this seminar, I guess, is the new landscape, which is marked by what people would call multipolarization and regionalization. Some would call it deglobalization, because we see these concepts such as energy sovereignty, food sovereignty, technological sovereignty gaining prominence, testing the belief in the global collaboration. And then we, of course, have US leadership, which is challenged and power is distributed more among a wider group of actors. We often hear about China or the new role of the coalitions of the global south and so on. And all this, of course, did not happen from one day to the other. But with Trump in office, I think the structural issues and challenges are becoming more clear. And for me, they raise a key question, and that is what I will reflect a bit on. So these transformations that we see today, are they like necessarily a bad thing? Or can the decline of US dominance be interpreted in a way which is more positive? Can it lead to a more inclusive, maybe a more balanced global system? I will make 4 points, all relating to the maybe perhaps too optimistic interpretation of what is going on. But overall, my overall take is that there is actually a momentum for potentially creating a more global order in the midst of all this crisis mood that we hear a lot about in the media. So my first point is that if we look at the distribution of power in international relations today, it can potentially enhance global inclusivity. So we saw this Munich security report published earlier this year that stated whether the world is already multipolar or will ever be is debatable, but the world's multipolarization is a fact. So on one hand, power is shifting towards a larger number of actors who have the ability to influence key global issues. And on the other hand, the world is experiencing increasing polarization both between and within many states. So there's, of course, a positive dimension of it and a more problematic fragmenting aspect of these developments. But for countries who have long been very critical of US dominance, this moment is, I think, predominantly interpreted as new opportunities for creating this more inclusive international system, because it allows for diversity in leadership, diversity in agenda setting, and ensuring some policies that do not just reflect one worldview. And we are, I think, already seeing this and have been seeing this for years in many ways. So a country like Brazil pushing for climate justice, India leading South-South cooperation, African countries demanding more fair terms in global trade, or South Africa taking Israel to the International Court of Justice. And adding to this, we of course also have the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, increasingly like influencing global affairs or the power balance in the world. And these countries all have this shared narrative of promoting a multipolar world order, one in which they seek a greater representation in. For instance, in institutions like the UN Security Council, in global financial bodies, and so on. And as I see it, their call for reform, not only these countries, but the call for reform reflect very long-standing grievances about Western dominance in global governance. So my second point is that we are seeing a trend towards regionalization and issue-based partnerships, which is not the opposite of global collaboration. So it does not necessarily undermine global collaboration. So in parts of the world, issue-based partnerships have been the normal way of thinking about alliances since the end of the world wars. And this is sometimes portrayed as one of the biggest challenges to good forms of multilateralism for different reasons, and some of them are good reasons. But regional organizations can potentially complement the UN, addressing issues more rapidly, more contextually, They can potentially tackle regional issues and crises before they escalate to a global level, and they can also serve as instruments for integration, for peace, and for security, which is actually the main purpose of global multilateralism. And we also have examples such as, now you mentioned, Peter, the African Union, which is, even though it is perhaps not so integrated a constellation or union, then it is still playing a role in conflict mediation, and also in setting some kind of long-term strategic goals for development. Another player is, for instance, the Shanghai-based, the Shanghai Cooperation Council, the SCO, which has emerged as a very significant platform that have regional security issues in Central Asia as the main focus, but also counterterrorism and diplomatic dialogue. It's a different model of multilateralism, of course, less institutionalized, and more flexible, some would say, than frameworks such as the NATO, or prioritizing non-interference and consensus-based decision making, but on the other hand, also looking away from issues of human rights and repression and so on. But again, if we take it together, they represent a large percentage of the world population, both the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and the BRICS country, and overlapping or complement each other in this resistance against the US dominance in the world. So I just saw a recent article from Financial Times when I was preparing for this presentation that pointed out something I think is very interesting in this context, that it said that even as US is pulling back from global leadership and its role in global leadership, the rest of the world is actually not passively just waiting. Instead, we see some of these regional forums and platforms and frameworks stimulating new forms of cooperations and continuing more flexible and more locally legitimate and decentralized forms of collaboration. So I thought that was interesting in the in our thinking about whether regionalization is actually a process which stands in contrast to globalization and global collaboration. My third point is, and I can do it very briefly, I can see time flies. Okay. I have 4 points altogether. So this is my third point, is that, and I know it can sound really optimistic right now, and I know of the critical debates also, but I think that a lot of the public debate is caught up in this crisis mood, and we need to look at the opportunities that these transformations are also creating if we really want to go for the purpose of creating a more just, more peaceful, more secure world, not only for the West, but of course for the entire world. So my third point is that reducing this over-reliance of on a single power, on the US, obviously have some long-term benefits. We can't see them right now because everything looks really shaky right now. But even the World Economic Forum has noted that the shift away from the US-dominated world reduces so-called systemic risks. So when one country holds so much power and have so many funds they can cut, like they're doing right now, it's so when there is some shifts in the internal policies of that one country, or if they take some kind of crazy foreign policy decisions, then it can destabilize the entire global system. And we of course have seen this recently. Sudden withdrawals from climate agreements, trade wars, and you all know the story of Trump. But the point is that the present transformations can actually lead to a reduction of the risks of over-reliance on a single power. And that is, in the long run, a good thing. It doesn't, of course, eliminate conflict. It can nurture more conflict in the global system, but it can also force us to rethink multilateralism, the global ones, the regional ones, the issue-based ones, and their connections. How can we coordinate better between the different levels in the international system, and how can we create a more robust international or global architecture around it? A last thing which is positive about this development is, and it is particularly positive for small and medium-sized countries, like a small country like Denmark, is that it opens up for diversifying partnerships, and diversification is again a good thing if you see it as an expression of an increase in agency or an increase in resilience. And I think Denmark is having these debates right now because of Greenland and Trump's interference in wanting to buy Greenland and so on. So it's a very topical debate for Denmark right now to diversify partnerships. And now Denmark is increasingly talking about creating stronger bonds to the Nordic neighboring countries. So here is where my optimism sharpens even more, and that's my fourth point and last point, and I think a good bridge to the next presentation. I think this is really an exceptional moment for thinking about reform of multilateral institutions and how they can best work for what is the main purpose, namely global security, global peace, global equality, as I see it. Again, I'm trying to back it up with different reports. So a Chatham House report just said that, again, this transformation we are seeing with the US, it's not just about the redistribution of power, but it's also about a new opportunity for reforming global institutions and creating mechanisms to bridge global and regional organizations on the overall objectives of peace, equality, and security. So I think overall, I'll wrap it up now, and I'll go to my final sentence, which is that all of this means that the U.S. hegemony is not, or the decline of U.S. hegemony is not just the end of global collaboration. The more pessimistic reading of this shift is, of course, one of fragmentation, a world divided into competing blocks marked by rivalries, mistrust, and deadlock, which is also, of course, part of the story. But I think the erosion of U.S. dominance isn't necessarily the breakdown of the system, but it's also an opening, and it's a chance to make the system more attuned to the voices that have long been left out from global governance. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mona. I think this is exactly why I invited you to come and say what you said, because you're representing a voice that doesn't have a lot of space at the moment in terms of the optimism and also seeing the opportunities in all the doom and gloom that is happening in the world. And of course, it is that optimism is not really reflected, I think, in the UN system, as far as I have understood the debates in New York and also our conversations over the last few months after Trump came to power. But it's a very interesting. There's an opening in what you're talking about that is sort of showing a different path than we're usually talking about. So I think that is really, really an interesting perspective. So thank you for that. We will now invite Richard to the stage, and I can't even imagine what you're going to say, but Richard will talk about the UN and the challenges that the UN faces in these times of change. Richard, over to you.
Thank you. Is this this is working good? Well, thank you so much, Peter. It's a pleasure to be back in the Institute, and thank you so much, Mona, for trying to raise our spirits, which I now intend to lower by describing the current zeitgeist, I guess, in the UN system and some of the pathways forwards for the UN in a very difficult time. I think it's actually incredibly helpful, Mona, that you laid out a big picture, long-term view of where you are, of where we are, in terms of moving towards a more global governance. I think that if I were to look over the long term, I would very much agree with your assessment of where we may be going. But in the more immediate political moment, I think certainly the United Nations and some other parts of the international system simply are in a moment of crisis. And as I was listening to you, I was reminded of a story that I think is true about Winston Churchill. Because in 1945, after winning the Second World War, Churchill famously lost the first post-war elections in the UK. And his wife said to him the next day, well, darling, this may be a blessing in disguise. To which he responded, if so, it is exceptionally well disguised. And I think if you were to go to the UN headquarters in New York or Geneva or even the UN city just across the street, and were to say that this is really a moment of opportunity, most UN officials would say they had a little difficulty seeing that right now. But I think it is probably true that this is a moment of real crisis for the existing international order. But it is also a moment where a range of possible futures for international cooperation opens up. Some, as you say, not good futures. I mean, fragmentation is a real possibility, but some much more positive. So what I'm going to do in my remarks is, as I say, just try and give you a little sense of the mood at the United Nations over the last 4 months, as the Trump administration has put a lot of pressure on the organization. I am then going to talk about a debate that is emerging about where the UN should go and what the UN should prioritize in this context. And actually, I will then end by sort of relating that to some of Mona's points about what various options for UN reform would mean for the politics of global governance in the medium to long term. So to start with the immediate moment, though, I think that for all of us who have worked around the UN for some time, and I've worked around the UN in different capacities for 20 years, the last 4 months have been humbling, and they've been humbling for 3 reasons. Please note that I'm saying humbling. We have a US administration that likes to humiliate its opponents, and I don't want to say that we have been humiliated, but we have been humbled for 3 main reasons. The first reason is that we have discovered that the UN system as we knew it, and the UN system as we tried to defend it, was fundamentally dependent on US goodwill, financially and politically, to an extent that even those of us who knew the system well maybe hadn't fully appreciated. What we've seen over the last 4 months is the US firstly freezing and then in many cases totally zeroing out funding for UN organizations. And this has brought home to us in financial terms just how much we depended on the US. Washington is supposed to pay about a quarter of the regular UN budget and the UN peacekeeping budget, but it's actually been paying in recent years a far, far higher percentage of the money that the UN spends on humanitarian crises in particular. Last year, the UN system as a whole processed about $35 billion on dealing with humanitarian crises. Of that, roughly 40% came from the US. And some particular UN agencies doing some of the hardest work in crisis zones were even more dependent on Washington. So the World Food Programme last year had a budget of about $9 billion, and almost exactly half of that came from the US. If you look at other agencies like the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, that was more like 40%, but still a very, very large amount. And so what we have seen is the primary funder of a huge amount of multilateral activity simply cut off funding almost completely in most cases. There's a trickle of money going from Washington to the UN for some specific situations like Lebanon, but it really is tiny. This is roughly analogous to the UN going to an ATM, going to a cash machine, and suddenly discovering that its bank card doesn't work. The money is not there. And so in very real terms, UN officials, especially in Geneva and Rome, which are the main humanitarian hubs, are now having to work out, firstly, how to shrink their staffing. Thousands of jobs are already scheduled to be cut, but also where to cut off, in some cases, life-saving aid to very vulnerable people. If you're sitting at the World Food Programme, if you're sitting at UNHCR, the question that faces you very immediately is, where are you going to stop feeding people? And where are you going to stop offering shelter? So at a very human level, right at the moment, this is creating crisis conditions for a lot of the world's neediest people. I think this sort of recognition of how reliant we have been on the US, how we have talked about global governance and multilateralism, but have really been talking about a system that depended on the US, has been very, very striking for all of us. We've talked about US dominance of the system for many years, but it has become very real when we see some of these cuts coming through. The second reason we feel humbled is that the Trump administration hasn't even tried especially hard to do this. There have been previous UN administrations, like the George W. Bush administration 20 years ago, that did have quite a strong ideological dislike for the UN. And some of you will remember, for example, John Bolton, who was briefly Bush's ambassador to the UN and argued that you could take 10 floors off the UN headquarters building and no one would notice. What's weird is that actually the Trump administration doesn't have that sort of specific targeted dislike for the UN. The UN cuts have just been a form of collateral damage from the fact that the Republican administration has closed down USAID and is targeting what it sees as liberal and woke causes in Washington. There is very little evidence that the Trump administration is really thinking about what it's doing to the UN. We do not have, after 4 months, a US ambassador in New York. A lot of the decisions that are being made about US policy towards the UN are being made by mid-level officials, some of them political, some of them actually career diplomats who are simply trying to be more Trump than Trump. The UN is suffering hugely, but it's really just a side effect of a broader shift in the way that the US does policy. And I think that's quite humbling for us too. It brings home again our reliance on the US. And then I think the third reason that we feel humbled is nobody is coming to save us. In 2018, during his first term in the White House, President Trump didn't target the UN as seriously as this, but he did actually take away quite a lot of funding from quite a lot of UN agencies. And he did pull the US out of quite a lot of UN arrangements like the Paris Climate Change Deal or mechanisms like the Human Rights Council. But back then, there were countries that came to help, and especially members of the European Union came to help. And we saw European governments and the EU finding additional money to cover the gaps that the US was creating. And you may remember that France and Germany led an initiative, I'm sure Denmark was a member, called the Alliance for Multilateralism, which was this loose coalition of states that was arguing you still needed international cooperation. And that worked. It was very striking that over the first term of President Trump in office, the multilateral system went through some difficulties, but it did not face any really severe breakdown. If you go back to 2017, you can find people who were predicting that Trump could force a breakdown at the UN, but it didn't happen, in very large part because a significant number of countries, primarily other Western countries, stepped up financially and politically to defend the UN. This time around, that is not happening. In November and December of last year, UN officials naturally went to European capitals and said, we're expecting cuts, although actually at that time I don't think the UN understood how bad the cuts would be. You know, have you got cash? And the answer in almost every European capital has been no. The answer in almost every European capital has been, we are moving money away from aid, we are moving money away from multilateral issues, and we are putting that money into defense. Now, let me say immediately that there are a few honourable exceptions to that trend. Denmark is one of them. You have not cut your aid spending. Germany, we're waiting to see on what the new coalition does, but Germany has remained, I think, pretty solid. And the EU institutions have actually remained pretty solid in Brussels. But almost everyone else is actually cutting aid at the same time that the US is cutting aid. Since January, we've seen the UK in particular go for a big aid reduction. The Dutch have significantly reduced their spending on organizations like UNICEF. A number of UN officials have said to me, actually the Europeans are using Trump as a cover to do what they wanted to do anyway, which is to shift money towards defense. And so there's no money coming from the European Union at scale to solve this problem. And so where else can you go for money? Well, everyone's had the same idea, which is China. And there has been a parade of UN officials reaching out to the Chinese, basically saying, would you like to buy the UN system on the cheap? Because, you can. If China wanted to, it could gain an enormous amount of influence over the UN system simply by putting cash into some of the areas where the US is leaving. China has built up a lot of influence at the UN over the last decade. It really started around 2015. We've seen China taking on more UN leadership posts. We have seen it putting financing into some areas of UN cooperation. I think there are some within the UN who had actually hoped that China would effectively step in and replace the US as the institutional guarantor. But China does not want to do that. China is facing financial headwinds of its own. And I think that China sees some parts of the UN as being very useful to it, especially some development agencies that have promoted the Belt and Road Initiative. But more generally, I don't think China wants to take the responsibility of bailing out the UN system if the US won't support it. So we are not seeing a Chinese takeover of the UN system. On the contrary, we're seeing, I think, Chinese diplomats being a little nervous because they realize that they are not going to meet the expectations of other states that had hoped that Beijing would lead where the US would not. And so nobody is coming to save us. And to be very frank, the mood amongst a lot of diplomats in New York at this moment in time, from different regional groups, is fine. Let's treat this as an opportunity. No one approves of the way that the US has gone around these financial cuts. But actually what I encounter when I'm talking to representatives of many member states is a sense that the UN had overextended. The UN had taken on too many mandates. There is too much duplication in the way that especially the big humanitarian agencies work. And probably the UN needed to go on a diet in the first place. And the fact that it's being forced onto a diet by the US isn't very pleasant. But it may be what was necessary for some time. And so what I think we've really learned or has really been brought home to us over the last 4 months, is again something that Mona referred to, which is just there are a lot of countries that no longer believe that the UN, as it's instituted, is meeting their needs. And in fairness, a lot of countries have been saying that from different angles. Western countries have been emphasizing that they feel let down by the UN because the organization cannot really do anything to penalize Russia over its aggression against Ukraine. Countries from the global south have been telling us that the UN is letting them down when it comes to promoting international development and especially dealing with climate change. People have been saying this for a while, but I'm not sure that we've always been listening. And actually, now when we are really in a very difficult situation, the reality that the organization has lost credibility and legitimacy in a lot of different quarters suddenly comes pretty hard, and it hits us where it hurts. So where does this leave the UN? Where does the UN go? In the short term, the UN is doing what you have to do when your bank card doesn't work, which is working out how to make savings. And in a very immediate way, this involves not only cutting off some programming, but it also means that the UN is looking to downsize a lot of departments. Actually, Antonio Guterres and all the senior UN leadership were here 10 days ago to discuss this very issue. And there is already a sort of a budget plan coming into shape that will shrink most UN departments by at least 20% to make savings. There are proposals to move UN officials from expensive places like New York and Geneva to marginally cheaper places like Nairobi to save money. I'm told that UN City is safe. Don't worry, it's still going to be there. But these are all short-term measures, and these are not going to be enough to carry the UN forward on a multi-year basis. The second level of thinking that is going on inside the UN system is, okay, well, if we have to shrink, how do we turn this into an opportunity? How do we actually take this as a chance to rationalize UN agencies that have in many cases started to duplicate each other's work? And if you look around the UN, you can see some pretty obvious spaces to try and force some change. Do we really need 3 different agencies in Rome all dealing with matters related to food? Do we really need 2 agencies in Geneva, UNHCR and IOM, that both deal with human displacement and actually often run very similar programs in the same place, but following different mandates? Do we really need 3 different UN agencies that can all do demining work? Probably not. And so actually, it may again be possible to turn some of these cuts, some of this pressure into a more positive agenda for institutional reform. Now, there are obstacles to that. The UN system is bureaucratized and in some cases is set up in ways that make reform really hard. There are also cultural issues that divide UN agencies. If you go to Rome and you sit down with someone from the World Food Programme, you'll discover that they intensely hate everyone who works for the Food and Agriculture Organization because they're seen as a competitor. Similarly, in humanitarian agencies, there's a lot of competition across institutional lines. So trying to push these organizations together is going to be hard, and it is going to cause resentment. But I think it will probably have to be done, because at the moment we're still talking about some of these funding cuts as if they're hypothetical, but they are going to be real. And when you start running out of money, you have to start making lifestyle changes that you would otherwise not have appreciated. As I said at an earlier meeting today, if the Premier League in the UK was running out of money, you might have to try and merge Manchester United and Manchester City football clubs. The fans of both would hate it, but at the end of the day, you might have to do it. So maybe there is an agenda for positive institutional change that emerges from this negative political moment. But even then, I think we would have to accept that you are talking about a smaller UN system. And then that, I think, leads to what is really necessary, but isn't really happening yet, which is to have a political discussion about what sort of global governance actually matters to us. because, as Mona indicated, for a long period, the UN has been expanding and it has been trying to do many, many different things. And different states and different communities around the world have wanted the UN to prioritize different topics. I think in the West, there's a sense that the focus should be firmly back on peace and security. Even President Trump says that he wants the UN to focus on its primary mission of peace and security, although no one really knows what he means by that. But if you look to the global South, you will find that, unsurprisingly, the real focus is on the fact that the UN should be continuing to prioritize development. It should be trying to catch up on targets like the Sustainable Development Goals, and it should be doing more to help poor countries weather the effects of climate change. And that's a very, very different set of priorities and a very different agenda. And actually, within parts of the global South, there are many states who would like to see the UN's peace and security role shrink. You were referring, Mona, to the African Union. For many of our colleagues at the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa, it remains essential that the UN should continue to be a source of development assistance, but they would be quite happy to see the UN play less of a role on peace and security on the continent, because they would like to have greater autonomy. So there are differing visions of what the UN should do. I think that there are also extremely differing visions over what set of values and what set of norms the UN should be promoting. Again, if you're sitting, I suspect, in Copenhagen or in most European capitals, one of the successes of the UN over the years has been its promotion of liberal norms and progress on issues such as gender equality and other rights. Still a very, very incomplete agenda. It's almost impossible to talk about LGBTQ issues at the UN without getting blowback, but the UN has been a vehicle for progressive thinking. But we should remember that there are, many countries outside the West where these positions are at least controversial and sensitive, and that there are certain conservative powers, Russia and China among them, who would really like to roll back this sort of progressive agenda at the UN. And we now have a US administration that is also quite negative towards a progressive agenda at the UN. The Trump administration has insisted that the UN committees should stop using the word gender and replace it with men, women, girls, and boys. They have insisted that the UN committees stop talking about the effects of climate change. So we actually have a US that is now in some cases aligned with Moscow and Beijing, looking for a more conservative vision of global governance. And I think that while we're trying to work out to what extent the UN should prioritize peace and security, to what extent it should prioritize development, we're also going to have a bigger debate about values and what values should actually bind us together in the multilateral system. Now, this sort of high-level debate about what sort of UN we want hasn't really begun yet, as I say. Instead, everyone in New York and Geneva is quite naturally focused on the effect of short-term cuts, which is normal and human. And also, I think everyone is hedging because it's actually politically very sensitive for countries to talk too openly about the implications of US policy on the UN at the present time, because a lot of countries fear that that will invite retribution from Washington. Every country on Earth is having to undertake some sort of economic negotiations with the US to try and get out of the bilateral tariffs. There are a lot of countries at the UN that rely on US security guarantees. A couple of them are in the Security Council right now, like Korea. And if you're sitting in the capitals of those countries, if you're trying to deal with tariffs, if you're hoping to sustain US security guarantees, you don't have a very strong incentive to start causing trouble in the multilateral space and start challenging the Trump administration, because your priority remains bilateral relations with Washington. So everyone is hedging. Everyone is seeing if they can avoid the debate. But I don't think that can last forever, because as these financial cuts come through, and if and when it becomes clear that the US is not going to reverse those cuts, we are going to need a more serious discussion about what sort of international system we want and what multilateral priorities we should be focusing on. And I think one question now is whether that can be an adult, sensible discussion between states, or whether we're just going to have a big global shouting match. I rather worry that if we don't sort of work out a framework for a sensible conversation about what a smaller UN looks like, then you're just going to have different blocks venting their grievances as time goes by. I think there is still space to have a sensible discussion about what a smaller UN looks like. I think that countries like Denmark, in fact, especially those of you who have not cut your aid, could quietly reach out behind the scenes and talk to countries from the global south, so, such as Ghana or Mexico, and sort of say, we have a shared problem. How do we want this UN sort of downsizing and reform process to go? I think if we do that in a proactive way, that might reduce some of the friction that lies ahead. But we need to do that fairly quickly, because otherwise I think some of the tensions that I'm talking about over priorities are going to arise. So that is where things stand in the UN space right now. Just to finish, what does this imply for global governance more generally? As I say, I think there are a number of possible futures that lie ahead. Mona has outlined some of them, like regionalization. I think that if the UN loses leverage as an institution, then it almost certainly will mean that countries do start looking both to regional cooperation, but also to cooperation through coalitions like the BRICS increasingly. This is a moment where, as formal international institutions look shaky, informal coalitions look more attractive. Although I don't know to what extent some of the informal coalitions we're talking about can really take on some of the big operational tasks, especially associated with crisis management, that the UN has fulfilled. But I do think there will be a shift towards informality, a shift towards looser forms of multilateralism, and actually, that is a process that has been underway for 20 years. Trump is simply accelerating something that we have been witnessing since at least the 2008 financial crisis and the rise of the G20 as the framework in response to the financial crisis. But beyond this sort of shift towards looser coalitions and the shift towards regionalization, there are other possible futures. I think we should pause for a moment and recognize that the Trump administration does have its own vision of what a possible future might be for international order. As far as we can tell, based on his approach to Russia, and also based on his statements about Panama and Greenland, President Trump would like to move to a more 19th century world where international relations are not based in the UN Charter, are not based on global cooperation, but are far more based on spheres of influence, with big powers dominating their regional peripheries. And so Trump fairly explicitly would like the US to lock up the Western Hemisphere as its sphere of influence from the Caribbean to the Arctic. He's clearly open to the idea that Russia should solidify a sphere of influence in Ukraine. We don't know how far he envisages that sphere of influence reaching, but he's open to the idea. And then it's quite possible that Trump is also open to the idea of China having a sphere of influence in Asia, which might even include Taiwan. One interesting feature of US policy debates over the last couple of months is that the American commitment to Taiwan is coming into question quite a lot, and people asking whether it's really worth fighting for it. So, there is a Trump worldview of spheres of influence. As my colleagues at Crisis Group have said, he may know where he wants to get to, he doesn't know how to get there. And I think we've seen with the rather unsuccessful approaches to Russia, the rather tense relationship with China, there is no US master plan to create a world of spheres of influence. It's more of an instinct that Trump has. But it may be where we are headed, and then obviously that would raise questions about where, if at all, multilateral organizations would fit into the picture. I actually think that there would be some residual role for the UN, even in a spheres of influence world. I think that the US quite likes the idea of the Security Council as a place where it could do some minor deconfliction between itself, Russia and China. But this clearly wouldn't be a UN with a strong liberal value set or a strong normative value set covering many different regions. Again, there are lots of technical organizations affiliated to the UN that would continue to function. The Universal Postal Union has been around for over 150 years and will never die. There are forms of cooperation that you need under any circumstances. But I think you would have a much reduced UN in this world. The final possibility there are two versions of a final possibility I want to put on the table. One is that this is actually the moment where the countries of the global south really do, after a pause, step up and gain some of the authority at the UN that they have been calling for a long time. In a moment where Western countries are stepping back financially, they are inherently losing leverage in the multilateral system. So even without paying much more, we could be at a moment where China, India, Brazil finally manage to expand their authority in the UN system, whether through formal reforms or simply just through the balance of power in the system changing. And we might, as Mona said, be on a world to a more globalized global governance where a bigger range of powers do shape how the UN functions. That is one possible future. Another possible future is that you see a broader coalition of those Western countries that still believe in multilateralism, including, I would still say most members of the European Union, work with countries of the global south to try and hold the system together while the US is detached or semi-detached from the system. And I can see areas where actually there may be fruitful space for European countries and non-Western countries to try and rethink how the UN is approaching global problems. Just to take one example, I think everyone now has to admit that the UN approach to climate change is not working. The COP series of big global summits, which have scored some big diplomatic successes, have not stopped global warming. Global warming is already breaking the levels that was committed to 10 years ago in Paris. And there isn't actually one UN central agency that is charged with dealing with managing climate adaptation or the effects of global warming. Now, the US is clearly not going, at least for the next 4 years, to even admit that climate change is real. So if the European Union still has a residual interest in maintaining multilateralism, it would be quite a good idea to be reaching out to other blocs and to be reaching out to China saying, okay, how are we going to rework the UN's climate change mechanisms, which are quite widely spread and fragmented, so we have a sort of more rational response to the reality of accelerating global warming. So I can see areas where actually you can have West, non-West cooperation about strengthening multilateralism, even in the absence of the US. But these are all, these are all possible futures, and as I say, we have to start thinking through both immediate questions about preserving bits of the UN, and then possibly about what priorities we should be pursuing as we go forward. Finally, a question that comes up is, will the US come back? Although this US detachment from the UN system, I think, is pretty radical. It's much more radical than anything we saw under George W. Bush or in the first Trump administration, that the pendulum does swing. It is worth remembering that only 10 years ago we still had President Obama in the White House who believed in investing in strengthening the UN. It's conceivable that 10 years from now, due to the vagaries of US politics, we will be back to having progressives in the White House. And actually, you might have US administrations that want to undo the damage that I'm describing. But we can't be certain of that. I think that there are some deeper-seated reasons that the US, as its relative power in the world reduces, may not wish to invest in leadership at the UN in the same way that the Obama administration did or the Biden administration did. Also, if you live in the US, as I do, our domestic politics is really, really weird. And I would not be putting any money on any particular outcome in the next presidential election or the one after it. The best bit of advice I've been able to come up with, and which I will leave you with for colleagues at the UN about this question of whether the US will come back, is that you should try and remember the end of your first serious romantic relationship. Most people, and I speak from experience, when they reach the end of their first serious romantic relationship, are heartbroken, they pine for their lost partner, and they often do things to try and get the lost partner back, like you get a haircut, you improve your diet, you become a nicer person. Now, again, speaking from personal experience, and I think most of us know this, that very rarely works. The lost partner doesn't come back, but you are still a better person and you are still more mature. And so I think when I'm looking at the US, yes, we should do reforms. We should make the UN a better place. We should overhaul the multilateral system, and we should hope that at some point the US will come back. But it may not. But it will still be worth going through the process anyway. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Richard. Really, really interesting. I would like to invite Mona to come up on the stage as well, and then we'll take Q&A. And I think I brought these two people on the stage for a reason, and you can tell the very different perspectives that have been presented up here that I think both complement and also clash. But I think there is Mona has this gift of being very quietly provocative, which I really appreciate about Mona's approach to analyzing the world. And of course, Richard comes in also in his way, is very provocative, also very quietly, but also laying out the empirical day-to-day reality of the UN system as we are experiencing it and looking at it right now. So I think it's really two different perspectives that speak to each other in some ways as well. And now is your opportunity to ask some questions. So please raise your hands. And there's already a hand that came up.
Thank you. Sergey Utkin, international politics analyst. I have two questions. First to Richard. We just had, not that long ago, summit for the future, or summit of the future, in the United Nations, and that was exactly an attempt to revitalize the multilateralism and to bring everybody on board for that. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it looks like nothing worked. So what are the lessons learned from that? Do you think when we have next window of opportunity, we need to do something completely different, or maybe fix something with this idea of a huge summit that brings people together and they discuss ideas on how to foster multilateralism? So what's your opinion on that? And the second to both Mona and Richard, you both spoke about possible future world orders, and much what you said reminded me of a concept of a fellow Danish scholar Trine Flockhart, the multi-order world. We will have the world where various orders will compete with each other, and at the same time what Mona said was kind of pushing in the direction of a more harmonious world that is still kind of structured and various levels work together with each other. But is it like you believe that there's still a chance that we will just come to that automatically, or do we have to do something very specific to make this more harmonious hierarchical relationship between various levels, global, regional, work?
Let's just reply, because I think we have a little bit of time. So if you want to launch into it, and then we have you and Lars afterwards.
Okay, very, very quickly on the question about the Summit of the Future. So last year, we had the Summit of the Future, which was an effort initiated by Antonio Guterres to get member states to talk about exactly some of the big picture questions we've been touching on. Where is multilateralism going? How do you make it fairer? So on and so forth. It resulted in a very long document called the Pact for the Future that I would imagine 2 people in this room have read, if we're lucky. So I would make 2 points. The first is the discussion of the Pact for the Future, which covered a huge range of issues. Ultimately, the negotiators had the luxury of being able to pretend that the UN could do everything. And so they piled up issue area on issue area. The UN was going to get better at conflict prevention, better at development. It's going to promote peace through sport. And that was a very different negotiating environment to the one where we're coming in, where we're going to have to admit that the UN cannot do everything. And we are not going to solve the problems that I'm describing with long documents just promising to do more. And so I think that the environment for discussing the future of the UN has fundamentally changed in a very short period of time. That said, I think also if you want to look at diplomatic process, the discussion of the Pact for the Future was complicated by the fact that all states were allowed to make suggestions and proposals on a consensus document sort of over 6 to 7 months. That is not a formula for sharp thinking. And that's actually why I say that I think that if we're going to have a serious discussion about where the UN is headed, it shouldn't start in sort of the General Assembly Hall in the UN where everyone is represented and everyone will have their pet project. Instead, you're going to need a smaller group of countries, representing different regions, to actually have a very honest discussion, probably away from New York, about what the market will bear and what they realistically see a smaller UN looking like. So I think we can think of process design in a different way, but I think the conditions of the moment are fundamentally different to a year ago. On your question about a harmonious system, I defer mainly to Mona, but just to say I don't think that a multi-order world is necessarily a very harmonious world. I think it's a world where you have a lot of different mechanisms and arrangements and agreements, to some extent complementing each other, but also competing with each other. And I think we should also be realistic that we're in a moment where it's very, very unlikely that major power competition is going to come to an end. To some extent, the competition is the point. And so I think an easy, harmonious world order is sadly not, probably not there for the taking.
Thank you so much. I think there might be a difference in how we actually analyze the world. If we see the world is already in a state of being multipolar or multi-order, if there already are these changes going on, or if it's something we imagine will happen in the future. If not, we do something. And I think for countries like China, India, places like South Africa, people would say we are already living in a multi-order world. This is already a transition that have, been taking place for decades now. And the dominant view in the West is not representative of the entire world. So I think in some parts of the world, they will look at the realities in a different way. And I think the reform debate relating to the UN system. I'm not a UN expert at all. I don't know so much about it, but I can say on an overall level, we discuss reforms relating to UN, either related to budget cuts or related to this power shifts in the world. But there's actually also a third reason why I think it's actually really important to discuss multilateral collaboration in the broader picture, and that is that we are seeing new actors on the world stage. We are seeing new types of conflicts that multilateral systems need to respond to, or need to handle, or need to intervene into. And some of the reform debate, I think, should be more explicitly linked to, so how do we handle actually a reality which is not a reality looking like how the world looked after the Second World War. So we have new types of conflicts, not just climate-related issues, but we have conflicts that are regional in nature, that easily transnationalize. We have poly crisis that Peter has also been writing about. So like overlapping crises, overlapping bundled conflicts that we need to figure out how to best handle on which level. And here I think that the regional organizations can sometimes have an advantage. And I think it's completely right that we need to figure out what kind of identity should the UN have in the future, because some are pushing towards this very idealist kind of interpretation of the UN as a very normative institution that needs to promote liberal democratic values. And in this world, it is, and where you can see that we have parallel kinds of powers emerging. It is really hard to hold on to that image of UN remaining or staying a very normative institution, a very value-based institution. I think a more pragmatic and maybe more easily handleable way forward will be to actually discuss what issues are actually best handled on which levels. And by which kind of actors, because there are actually, of course, overlaps in the globalized world that we live in. Of course, there are issues that countries have a common interest in discussing, and climate can be one. Pandemics are, another example. Conflicts, armament. These are still issues that are relevant and will remain relevant in the future. I don't know if that was an answer to to the question.
Thank you. My name is Carsten Pelder-Müller. I'm an archaeologist associated with the Cambridge Heritage Research Centre. I think I have one comment which leads to a question. The most dangerous moments in history is, of course, when great powers are not quite sure of how powerful they are and how powerful their potential adversaries are. That's where we really get into trouble. You've been talking about states. Mona, you referred to the role of big companies. I suppose you were thinking about things like the big tech corporations. Can I ask the two of you to say something about how you envisage their role and their play in this reshuffle of global balances? Obviously, we have an Elon Musk, because he is sort of visible in all senses, reaching out to control our global communication, our global internet access, and so on. And also pushing for a position in space adventures of various kinds. So, but there are others, less visible, more subtle actors. How do you see these actors play in? Should we regard them similar to the English East Asia Company of the 18th and 19th century, acting as a quasi-state on the subcontinent, or how should we see them? Thank you.
I think we're going to take a couple of questions more. Lars and Kirsten, if you can also ask a question, then we'll go back to the two panel.
Yes, I'm Lars Engberg Petersen here from DIIS. Thanks a lot for your presentations. Mona, I share your positive view in the sense that ideally, I think you are quite right in identifying these different trends and saying that there are opportunities here to be used. But I wonder, what are the political factors or political actors who will actually do something about it? Because you said that, well, something has happened here in Denmark in terms of more openness towards the Nordic countries. Yes, but there is very little understanding of this opportunity of actually trying to cooperate with countries in the global south. Because I guess a conventional idea is that small and medium-sized countries really need a rules-based world order, blah, 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 all this, and institutionalized multilateralism. And why not seize the moment and try to cooperate with and find these countries in the global south? But nothing happens. It seems that Europe is stepping down all the way around, and even in Denmark, where we have maintained the level of development cooperation, there's very little happening in terms of these ideas. So I wonder, where are the political actors who could actually push this forward? The other question is perhaps more to you, Richard. You talked about the UN reform. Yes. What about the main institutions, the Security Council and all that? I think there is a discussion somewhere about the UN Charter. Do you see any opportunities for a more substantial reorganization here, where the Global South will have more influence, where everybody will feel more represented? Is that at all a possible venue or avenue to go down of in the current situation? Thanks.
Yeah, and then we'll take another round.
Thank you, and thank you for your presentations. I'm Kirsten Larsen from Global News. A comment. I know the sort of plates are moving, but when I see the way both countries and UN diplomats react these times, it's going to take a while until the US is not the big power in the room. And I know it's dangerous when the big power is going down, but it seems to be taking a while. Everybody is ducking their heads and filling out their questionnaires from Washington. So I want to ask you, what are the chances of reform conducted under such pressure and in such difficult times that they will result in nothing else but cut-downs?
I will start, then I can pick. And I will start with the question about power and whether, we have alternative actors who are equally powerful, perhaps, or emerging powers that can challenge the status of the state. And yes, I was alluding to that a little bit, that today, when we look at who have the ability to influence conflict and peace in the world, then of course it's no longer just states, their militaries and economy that decides everything. That are of course major factors, and political scientists like myself have been trained in, looking at the state, looking at military, and looking at economy and economic dominance are of course still important factors in the world, and it will take a while before those factors does not matter anymore, because it does. They do. But we, at the same time, as you rightfully say, we have other powerful actors. We have private business enterprises, big tech companies. We have other factors, also factors that human beings cannot control, that affects conflicts and affects the developments and transformations of the structure in the world. And that can be, for climate is a very significant, I think, illustration of that is something beyond the human control, but still something that affects on how things develop globally. And all these changes in power and how we perceive power and who are the powerful in the world is something I think a UN reform process also needs to take into consideration. That it's not just the states, social movements, people across states can unite in very powerful ways because of social media, because of globalization, and so on. So actually, I think we're in a moment where we see actually very conflicting tendencies, because on one way you can say, okay, we are actually derailing processes of globalization. This is a moment of deglobalization and so on because of the regionalization. But on the other hand, people have not been so connected ever before in history as they are now. And you can see people mobilizing across battlefields, exactly because of new forms of power. And the power, of course, also of ideology, of narratives, and so on. So I think that's a very important point to take into consideration when we talk about rethinking the UN and what is it that these new institutions, multilateral institutions, should respond to. The second question that I will pick was the one about who are the, because Lars, you mentioned that you agree with the optimistic representation of the changes, but who are the actors, who are the political actors, you ask, who can actually take up that agenda in a positive way? I think that what Richard said about the parallel you made to the girlfriend thing, that we are still in this very paralyzed kind of situation where a lot of countries are trying to reorient themselves because we have been so reliant on the US. And saying what I said, that okay, this is actually a possibility, an opening for diversification in partnerships. That is something that is not the first thought in many people's mind, but it will be, oh no, we need to get that old girlfriend back, right? I think it's some of the same kind of mechanism, but we need to, of course, raise a debate about it. So what is actually the option and possibility for small countries like Denmark? And again, I think if we move ourselves a bit away from the Western context, you will see that these kinds of more loose partnerships, or not being so reliant on one partner, has been the pattern in other parts of the world. And a lot of people have been writing about that also recently, that it's a very Western phenomenon to think about very consolidated partnerships that have a long history, while other parts of the world have developed this more loose, issue-based, more pragmatic kind of alliance relationship to other countries. But I can't see the political voices myself, but I think there is a emerging debate also in Denmark about how can we actually rethink the way that we have been thinking about security guarantees. I think that's also a very important part of that debate. So do we need to think about the issue of security guarantees in a new way than we are used to? Because that was the main reason why we have been so reliant on the US, because we thought that US would be our security guarantee. But maybe that was just a theoretical normative idea. And now we need to maybe rethink our theories about what is actually a security guarantee for a small state like Denmark. And here I think diversification is actually the right strategy in this moment of time.
Look out for our forthcoming article on polygamous theories of international relations. It's probably been done. So very quickly, on Security Council reform, I wouldn't see much indication at the present time that the Trump administration will follow the Biden administration, which claimed, at least in theory, that it was keen to see progress on Security Council reform. I actually think that if the Trump administration has a vision of the Security Council, it is as a place, as I said, where the US, Russia, and China can do some deals. And we sort of saw a potential foreshadowing of that in February when, for the first time and to the great shock of Europeans, the US and Russia co-sponsored a resolution on Ukraine, calling for a rapid peace process. That may be what this US administration wants the Council for. And in that case, it has no particular incentive to invest in reform. And you can't reform the Security Council without all of the 5 veto members agreeing to the process. So I think, frustratingly, there is almost universal recognition in New York that the Security Council needs reform. That is something which even diplomats from permanent members will tell you very frankly. No one can pretend after Ukraine and Gaza and Ethiopia and Myanmar and Sudan that this body doesn't need some improvements, but I'm just not sure there's a political pathway there. And that will actually further complicate discussions about what the UN should prioritize, because I can see a lot of countries from a lot of regions, including from Africa, saying, well, if you can't reform the Security Council, let's just focus solely on development because we don't like the top decision-making body that you have to deal with security affairs. Look, on the US as still a big power, obviously the US is still a big power, but I would note 2 things about the Trump administration. Trump and his sort of, his inner circle, people like J.D. Vance, are very straightforward about the fact that the US has seen its relative power decline. I think more than any previous administration, they are frank about the fact that the US can no longer be a sort of global security provider in the way that it was in the 1990s. And I actually think that if you look at Trump's approach to many issues, it's actually based on a recognition of the limits of US power. So in security terms, I think that actually the US has already gone on a bit of a journey and sort of recognized its limits. Now, in economic terms, as the initial sort of burst of tariffs showed, the US sort of assumed that it was still all-powerful, but it's learning the hard way with China in particular that that isn't true. So, I think we actually, we face a situation which is slightly different, which is how do we sort of deal with a US that is, as a matter of choice, trying to cut down its global role, including through multilateral organizations, based on a surprisingly clear-eyed assessment of where the US stands in the global landscape.
We have time for a lot, but the UN person?
No, UN person.
I feel like the UN should have a voice as well.
I'm Eva, the UN person. I work for UNHCR. Yeah, so I come from just across the street. And thank you so much, Mona and Richard, for this really, really interesting debate and your presentations. Thank you for that. It's everything you say is super, super interesting and relevant. I also get this slight sense of it's a little bit intellectual discussion. So I live in the real world of the world of displaced people that UNHCR deals with. And I have a question probably for you, Richard. Your reflections on what's going to happen when we as an agency are not going to be there, when you have mass refugee influxes and crises, when millions cross borders, and we're not going to be there because there's not enough money because of the funding cuts. What's going to happen? So apart from the obvious humanitarian consequences which we talk about, this stability consequences or the sort of the stabilization of humanitarian operations is an aspect that we probably don't talk about so often. So how do you see that playing out with the cuts, with the scenarios that we look into when we're not going to be there at the border? There's no, and probably no one else. How is that going to impact on stability and on further movement? And how are the different geopolitical players going to respond to that? Is it important for them? Obviously, we are in Europe, and many of these conflicts are not happening so far away. So how do you see that? And then just a comment towards the end, when we talk about overlapping mandates. I mean, you know that in best of years, UNHCR is 50% funded for priority interventions. So it's not that you can discuss is an overlap between IOM and UNHCR. It's not that, are we doing too many livelihoods projects in a given country? I mean, there's a constant lack of funding for whatever we do, and so many unmet needs for millions of people. So I think it's a kind of it gives an impression that there's a kind of luxury that we are doubling up on efforts, where the reality is that it's the opposite. There's only 50% of needs are being met. So that was just my comment. Thank you.
Maybe we let Richard respond to this and Mona, and then we take the three hands at least in the air, 4, 5, whatever. So, but Richard, just respond to this, and then and also Mona.
No, I think it's fine.
Yeah, and then we'll take a round of final questions.
So, I mean, we would assume that the human fallout of conflict is going to be considerably worse if you don't have the humanitarian safety net that was there. And although I did refer to inefficiencies in the humanitarian safety net, I do believe the humanitarian safety net has been crucial. And actually, very bluntly, for the last 15 years, the Security Council has been sort of avoiding resolving certain conflicts for its own political reasons and basically dumping them on the UN humanitarian system, which is one reason why the humanitarian need has grown so much. I think that if you look at cases like Sudan and Chad, or Sudan and the Central African Republic, if conflicts in those places go unchecked, then you will just get more human movement and there will be cascades of destabilization. Now, how will different powers respond to this? I mean, I do think there is a possible scenario where the US sees some of these things happening, panics, and does give you back some money, but probably not in a very systematic fashion. And also the US will have cash for you to do life-saving aid in a hotspot, but they're not going to fund sort of longer-term livelihoods work. But so the US may re-engage a bit. I think that the Europeans will similarly engage a bit. But the scenario that we worry about at Crisis Group is there will be crises where there is always some money. So the Rohingya trapped in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, there will be money from Australia and Japan to help with them, perhaps. Conflicts close to Europe, there will be funding from the EU. But I think there is a risk that, especially in large parts of Africa, you get the abandonment of certain crises areas which just don't figure on anyone's top 10 list of priorities. So the sort of pain I was talking about, and which you're referring to, is not going to be evenly spread. There will be some crises that get even less attention than others. Just to say, I think the other thing that is of profound concern to us is what we're seeing now with US policy towards getting aid into Gaza, with the US sort of proposing essentially a non-UN mechanism to channel aid into Gaza, the foundation. We may also be entering a world where suddenly a bunch of private actors are out competing with the UN in the hope of raking in what money is available, and that will have very negative effects for sort of some pretty core humanitarian principles as well.
Okay, so I saw hands. The guy with the glasses. There's another guy with some glasses. So please.
Hi, thank you for your talk. My name is Romanos. I'm a student of international politics at Roskilde University. And I'm just wondering, when I talk to friends around my circle that are not necessarily as into politics, there's confusion over even like what the UN does in a general sense. And I'm wondering now, with this strategy of cutting budgets when the US is pulling funds, will there also be a strategy of showing to the people of like, this is what we do and this is what the impact of that cuts will be, to gain more public support on the matter?
And here also.
Yes. Okay. I know we don't have a lot of time, and there are many questions that can be raised. I would try to be focusing on a few things. I think that when we look at the global situation, we overlook quite a number of things. I worked in all parts of the world for the UN and NGO consortia and so on, and I have a lot of context still. A little bit to my surprise, after all these years, that I get several emails in my inbox during the week with almost comments about this and that. And to make it very quick, in terms of South America, we have a collapse of several countries in South America. Even Brazil is in a very difficult situation. A country that for 15 years and 10 years ago would have been seen almost an idealistic country, or ideal country, South America, would be Ecuador. It's also collapsing because of the overflow from Colombia. Venezuela is collapsing. Argentina has a lot of problems. Brazil has a lot of problems. So South America is really in a very weak situation. But they are clear about one thing. They want a permanent seat in the Security Council. And if you go to Africa, it's a little bit the same. But as you mentioned, yes, the Africa Union is weakened. And we see the problems in South Africa now, which are very serious, or not really covered in detail in the press here. I've seen a little bit in The Guardian. I've seen a little bit in Le Monde, surprisingly, but it's not something that really takes it. And so we have Africa in a lot of problems and weaknesses. We have South America, and even in Asia, we have a lot of problems coming up. We look at India as the big new country, but it has a number of very deep problems. And Modi's government is not putting the country together, or keeping it together. And we see that also now in the conflict in the Kashmir. So a big country, a coming country, the biggest country in terms of population, 1.4 billion, right? Or a billion must be, yes. And but really, and we see countries like the Philippines, to some extent Indonesia, big countries, more than 100 million citizens, also in deep problems. And what we don't see, and then I hope I can cut it short, but what we don't see is really a systematic analysis and approach and willingness to relate to these realities. So we have the BRICS, but what is BRICS? It's not taking over, it's not solving or really addressing these issues. So institutionally, we can point to the UN, but we have to look at the weaknesses. And that one small thing I would say, because I get some contacts from Central Asia, the countries in Central Asia are also in problems, partly because of the Russian economic problems, which we don't talk so much about here, but which we probably should talk about. And I don't think China is going to rescue that. These countries have also serious problems, and that weakens, let's say, the Asian possibility of playing its role. Okay, that was a too long comment.
People are drifting now, so unless very pressing questions, Richard on his way out to his taxi after the seminar, but just have you two sort of say the final.
You can start if you have.
Yeah, on public communications, look, I could spend the next day telling you everything that I think is wrong with UN communications, and would still have some time left over. I mean, I think the awful thing to say is that some of the pressure to respond to this crisis is going to come from people sort of seeing what the results are. And, this was the case in the 1970s and 1980s during the original sort of, humanitarian boom, which was that it was recognition of the famine in Ethiopia and so on, that drove an increased focus on humanitarian issues. Now, this is not how I would like to resolve the challenge, but I think that the sad reality may be that it's only when we start to see what happens when you don't have the UN or when you don't have humanitarian assistance that people will remember why it was valuable. But I think, and it's also worth saying that in the US, colleagues in Washington have discussed some of these issues with progressive Democrats, people from the left of the Democratic Party. And they have also been very honest with us. Their view is, well, it's a great pity. We do not like what Trump is doing, but we are not going to return to power on a ticket of, refunding the UN system. If you're sitting in Washington and you're a Democratic congressperson, you're going to be talking about domestic political effects. You're going to be talking about the incompetent handling of the economy, and so on. And so I'm not sure that even in the US, a lot of this communication will cut through very easily.
Final words.
Yes, I think most of the questions were addressed to Richard, but I would maybe say that as I heard your question about your friends, and when you talk to them, they are a little bit confused about the identity of the UN, and I think that is exactly the common theme here, that the identity of a future UN is actually being discussed right now because of the tragic backdrop, which is budget cuts and the Trump administration and so on, and that is why it sounds maybe more positive than it should, but the positive story will be that we can have a discussion about what should be the future role of the UN, how should the UN system tap into these regional manifestations and these local areas where surely we have conflicts and issues and so on. But the same goes to the situation within the US, of course. You didn't mention the US as a place where a lot of stuff is going on, and a lot of stuff is contested internally, domestically right now. So yes, South America have issues, and Africa have issues, and you can mention a lot of places in the world that have unsolved issues, and that is exactly the reason why this discussion is so important about the future role of the UN. And I'll stop there.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you.